Hello, everyone. Thanks, Piers, for the great introduction. My name is Steve White. As he said, I'm the Executive Director of Commerce at WongDuty, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I'll do a little setup, but before that, I'd love to let each of the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Kofi, and then we'll go to Jillian and Drew. So welcome, guys. And Kofi, how are you?
Steve, thanks for having me. My name is Kofi. I'm G. Kofi Annan. I'm a cultural, as Pierce says, I'm a cultural strategist, technologist. And my role, I've worked in kind of on the agency side and on the brand side. And really where I focus is on looking at data and cultural insights and how can that be used to inform brand building, brand experiences, brand partnerships. So really kind of bringing that outside voice of the customer and the market into the conversations that are happening around business planning and product creation. So glad to be here.
Great, thanks. Jillian?
Hi, I'm Jillian Shapiro. I am a Director of Digital and Data Marketing at WongDuty. I've spent about the last 12 to 13 years on the agency side, focusing on advertising technology, both on the media side and on the creative side. At WongDuty, I'm on the commerce side and strategizing digital activations to bring data and insight into the commerce practice. Thanks.
Awesome. Finally, Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew, Andrew Jaspers. I am the senior designer on the commerce team at WongDuty. My focus is on the retail environment, the physical environment. Over the past 10 years, I've worked both sides on brand and on the retail environment. And so I bring a sort of brand experience and storytelling to the retail environment.
Awesome, and that's a lot about what we're going to talk about today. So really excited to have the three of you and hear your perspectives. And as I do a little preamble or a little setup, I think, we certainly don't have all the answers. We've been talking a lot though, and this session, as Piers mentioned, actually started out kind of as a retailer roundtable session where we had been reaching out to retailers at WongDuty and speaking with them and asking them questions about everything from how they're opening to what conversations they're having with their team, what they're reprioritizing. And quite frankly, we learned a lot. And so I thought, the number one takeaway from this session today is hopefully the folks watching, we'd love for you to contribute to the ongoing conversation, but also, love to hear more about what you're doing, and we'll share our experiences with you today. Kind of the premise of our talk around how stores can adapt and be inclusive for everyone is based on a couple of trends or a couple of facts that have come to light. But everything is centered around this notion that for retailers really to succeed, that people are going to have to come back to stores. As we look at the prevalence of e-commerce and we've experienced 10 years of growth in 3 months, I think that's been iterated even earlier today in some of the sessions. As we look at curbside and buy online, pick up in store, we see the explosion of those behaviors being adopted. But truthfully, retailers aren't going to be able to survive on those services alone. We saw Target posted record numbers of gross revenue and sales in Q1, actually reported a net loss because they incurred $500 million in costs due to COVID and due to the acceleration of online purchasing, BOPIS, and other things. Now, they're not going to incur those costs forever ongoing, but it does show the importance of getting shoppers back into the store. So as shoppers do come back into the store, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how can we really grasp this opportunity while we're rethinking the store experience to go beyond just fixing some acute problems, maybe around BOPIS or around curbside, and how can we look at the broader retail environment and how accessible it is to all types of people and all types of technologies. And I think that in that spirit, we've developed a couple of questions today that these panelists are going to chat about. And I'm really excited. I don't want to give away kind of the first insight because actually I was super inspired when Kofi brought it up in one of PSFK's earlier sessions, which was the retail response to social injustice, the town hall. And it was a stat about a study that Kantar had did. And Kofi, if you don't mind, I'd love for you to kind of take us through, kind of the results of that study, because it was pretty surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was the reason I brought it forth to that discussion was I think it was definitely insightful, particularly from a quantifying the experience perspective, right? So people could talk about their experiences, and we hear a lot of experiences being verbalized online and offline about experiences with brand. But what I thought the report did was really quantify that, right? And what the Kantar report did, it was done last year, and one of the insights was that people of color, specifically Black African Americans, as they expressed the places and the context to which that they have been discriminated against, and they feel kind of the most nervous and the most not at ease while shopping, was the number one. Now, in our current climate, we are really focused on a lot of what sparked the broader conversation around change within the retail sector across business and society, was really about the African American community's interaction with the police. But surprisingly, when we really look at the data, while shopping was number one, number two was workplaces and schools. So where people are working and spending a lot of time during the day, they find a lot of discrimination and bias there. At restaurants, so while eating. And then in the context of our current climate, interactions with law enforcement was actually number four. So when you look at the data does show that while there are areas and for improvement, that one of the big missing pieces is within that retail sector, within that business, the consumer, the Black consumer, person of color's interaction with the businesses and with the brands. And that's where we see a lot of the tension happening.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that was just so striking to me. And as we think about fixing retail or redoing retail at this kind of pivotal juncture, it just makes sense to me that we would try and address some of those issues at the same time. There's two other issues that actually came up to me before we jump into the questions that are kind of in that same vein, and they cover some of the topics that we're going to chat about. The first one is the notion around digital accessibility for all, right? And there's a couple studies out there that actually have indicated that retail businesses owned by people of color around the 20% mark. So 1 in 5 retail is owned by the communities of color. But those retail outlets only generate about 5% of the total retail revenue, right? So there's a big disparity there. And there's a lot of summation that part of that is access to technology, both on the retailer side, the folks that own the retailers, but then also their user base and their communities. And so as we jump into that, I think that those three, the third thing is around access via mobile. Communities of color overwhelmingly access via the Android operating system. We know a lot of shopping, a lot of apps, and the most purchasing actually happen on iOS, right? So as we jump into technologies, all three of those things really can frame the question. So with that, I'm going to jump into it, and the first topic is going to be data. And so Jillian, I'm going to kind of lean on you as we get started. There's a couple of things going on. One is we've been collecting data about shoppers for years now in hopes of providing them with personalization. We've seen, and in our conversations with other retailers, we've really been wondering, is all that data gonna matter anymore, or have behaviors changed so much that we're gonna have to start over and regather data? And then the second thing is, you and I were talking about some articles earlier this week around AI and facial recognition and how some of the models might be flawed, especially in recognizing people in a shopping environment. African Americans, women, other people of color are really being misrepresented by that technology. So that's a lot to unpack, but I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the data question came up when obviously the pandemic started. 4 months ago, and obviously the shopping retail stores have shut down completely. There was more e-commerce going on, but personalization has always been based on legacy data. And we kind of have gone down a rabbit hole over the past few years where it was the more data, the better, the more we could find out about a consumer, the better we would be, or the more we would be able to make their experience a good one and have them convert in our stores. But the pandemic started and behaviors completely changed. So how do you compare that against the data that we had? I'm not sure. Is it worth it to compare? Is it worth it to completely toss it out and start from scratch? A big part of me thinks that we do have to start from scratch because I think very few people's behaviors have not changed at all. I think everyone has changed their shopping behavior in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a minimal amount or a big drastic amount, from the shift from e-commerce or from in-person to e-commerce or back and forth, as well as what they're spending on and when. So I would definitely isolate those data sets from the pandemic on. And then additionally, it just begs the question, what do we do with machine learning on that? So machine learning, obviously, as everyone knows, works a lot better when you have a large data set and you're looking over time and you're looking to forecast. So that is going to be a lot harder, I think, for brands to speak to consumers and understand exactly what they want. And I think that plays into multiple phases of not just the pandemic, but everything that's going on in the country. It's going to be a lot harder to forecast. So it's going to take some isolating of certain data sets, looking at the new shopping behaviors, potentially comparing it to other points in times where we saw similar shifts in shopping behaviors and figuring out what consumers really need and want. As far as the AI goes, I was really intrigued by this. It's been obviously in the news for the last weeks now, and utilizing artificial intelligence and facial recognition. I've used AI a lot and just in a data practice, from a data practice perspective, and gaining other insights that maybe aren't by what someone writes or anonymous data sets of attributes, but just so you can see things visually and use AI and from that manner. Facial recognition seems like a step above or a step beyond what I think we're used to as far as identifying who the people are. My preference is to keep everything anonymous as much as possible, and make them have a better consumer experience without violating privacy. So I think the privacy around facial recognition is a huge issue. And I'm not really sure how much it comes into play with the ads that we make, or potentially apps, and from a digital perspective, how we want to use that. But I think we have to tread pretty going forward. And I definitely hear people's concerns around facial recognition.
Yeah, and that just leads me to believe as stores start to be redesigned, there's going to be more opportunities to gather data, whether that's through contactless payments or touchless interactions with technology that and things like that. Drew, you wrote a piece a couple weeks back that was actually published on PSFK around some of the store design considerations, and I wonder if you might mention a couple things that came out of your piece that you think are proving themselves out since you've written it, or if there's even more considerations as we start to move into kind of getting shoppers back and thinking about the new versions of the store.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. I think one of the biggest things that I've seen is that flexibility within the retail space is going to be paramount going forward. And just from a physical standpoint, investing in a huge amount of space isn't going to prove financially viable going forward as well, because you lose a lot of flexibility in the way that you move fixtures around, displays, all sorts of things like that. We saw yesterday that Nike said that they're going to roll out 150 to 200 of the Live platform, which is a small neighborhood store, which from a data standpoint also gives an advantage in terms of studying micro groups rather than macro groups and whatnot. So I think flexibility is the key going forward. We're also seeing that certain materials in terms of viruses are take to viruses differently. So maybe a poured concrete kiosk isn't the greatest idea moving forward. So I don't think, what we've seen also is that a lot of people are trying to come out with really concrete answers in an idealistic world. And I don't think that that's necessarily the right approach either. It's not as much where we end up from here. It's more about the trajectory and that we're heading in the right place. So I don't think having really firm answers at this point is necessarily the best thing, but using the space to experiment and try things and learn things and adapt right now is going to be really key going forward.
That's awesome. Actually, we have a question, and I think it's super relevant. I'd love to bring it up, which it's from Paul. And he says, we're focused on the idea of creating truly healthy in-store spaces, pure air, types of paint and lighting and things like that. I think personally, some of the greatest experience elements of going into a store are the textures and the different things. Like, are we moving toward an area where everything's going to be, minimized for microbes and become more streamlined in visual and in materials, you think, or are we just going to be smarter about it?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that's a little bit idealistic. I saw a lot of new things coming out that were, in a perfect world, this is a good solution type thing, but they kind of lack a certain humanity. Part of the whole retail experience is just getting out, being public, hanging out with people. And there is, for most retail outside of groceries and certain products like that, there's a very tactile nature to it that's really necessary. So I think, and I think also when you just look at in your own life, like for me, when I go to a grocery store, 30% of people are wearing masks. So I don't think humans are just necessarily going to lock and stock, go down this path of clean, perfect everything. I think that there's a lot of resistance to it. And I think that there's going to have to be some middle ground on where we end up with that. So, yeah.
Awesome. Kofi, there's a couple of things that Drew brought up there that I want to chat with you about. The first was he was talking about the Nike stores and how they're really making smaller community-based stores. You and I had a conversation because I was like, I really like that localized merchandising. I can look online and see what products people are searching who live in that area, and really kind of start to tailor what is a national footprint to local communities. But you and I talked about there also could be a risk with that. And you had some cool solutions. So I wanted to ask you about that, and then we'll come back to Drew's other point.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of bringing the old approaches to a new reality, right? So the opportunity is, as Drew mentioned, there are these kind of micro groups or micro cultures, or even kind of localized experiences. And that's an opportunity for, as you mentioned, brands to really understand the local, who's in the area, how they're shopping, what, really understand the product that are moving, and so on and so forth. But if you take the same kind of macro viewpoint where really the brand is really trying to normalize and make every market similar, then that could kind of go wrong. So I think one of the things that we'll probably start seeing some of the trends happening in news reports and in some conversations is brands and businesses really localizing not just the experiences, but also the product selections as well, right? The supply chain, how they're really getting the products that make sense for that market and for that group, and how they're making sure it's stocked. So how are they really tapping the neighborhood and the group for the products themselves? We saw recently one of a fashion designer out of Canada, based in Brooklyn, brought up this thing called the 15% challenge, right? And she posited that brands, African Americans, people of color, are at the minimum 15% of the U.S. population, so the shelf space should reflect that. And through in the past couple of weeks, a lot of big brands have said, well, it's really difficult. And, how do we really do? Because again, we're looking at it from how do we normalize and how do we standardize across markets and across groups. But you see brands like Sephora and Rent the Runway, and I'm sure you're going to see a lot more of those bigger brands start to realize that there is an opportunity there to localize, get invested into the neighborhoods, and look at those micro groups and those micro cultures, learn from them, but then also invest in that culture so that there's a relationship there as well.
Cool. Yeah. And as you work with different companies, we talked with Jillian on the data side, we talked with Drew on the store side, but there's really this notion that that the store of the future is going to have this be very technologically based. But I don't think that technology adoption is as easy for all groups, and some people are more familiar with it than others. Can you talk about how you're dealing with adoption of technologies and how you're introducing new technologies to different people who may not be as savvy as others?
Yeah, again, one of the things that we're seeing, the way how things used to work and the different approaches that brands used to take, and where brands really need to start rethinking internally how they're both gathering data and insights and also how they're interpreting it, is also the understanding and the definition of certain criteria, for instance, for sophistication of markets and sophistication. What does technology adoption mean, and how does that affect the brand, particularly in different markets? So certainly in some markets, say immigrant markets, groups, or different other neighborhoods, from a technology sophistication, day-to-day use perspective, besides a mobile phone, that adoption isn't there. But I would argue that there's a different kind of innovation that's working as it relates to how goods and services are exchanged, how people are accessing information, and how they are also sharing information and sharing products. That is a blind side for a lot of brands, because again, we're looking at kind of a mobile first, iOS centered, urban centered way of approaching business and experiences. So I think as we're in the near future, we'll see a kind of a meeting of both where culturally the technology adoption is, but then also on the brand side and in the retail side, what that technology means for an in-person experience. And there's still a lot of innovation there, but I think there's a lot to be learned from both within the US, but then also externally and looking at other markets also, particularly in Africa or some of the emerging markets as well, for some really cool ideas.
Awesome. And Jillian, I assume as we get that technological adoption up, that's going to provide us with more opportunities for data and more opportunities to kind of have more contextual messaging and conversations with the consumer base.
Yeah, absolutely. If we're dealing with new data sets, as I think we need to going forward, I think as far as data points go, it's kind of infinite, right? There's all kinds of data that we can collect. It's just changing our strategy and outlook on what we actually need to know and putting those data sets together so that we can make things, whether it's apps or the in-store experience or e-commerce, more relevant and user-friendly. So feeding the user experience from that perspective with the appropriate data versus just grouping everyone together and kind of making a universal experience, we can actually get much more intricate at making the retail experience more inclusive, and having many data sets at our disposal will basically allow for that.
Excellent. And then we can reach out to each of those groups with specific types of messaging and or instructions or et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. We can, the sky's the limit as far as personalization goes. It's just putting the work in to get the right data sets and analyze them and be able to have a very unique strategy to utilize that data in the appropriate way, which is where I think traditionally we've fallen down. Even when retail was super great and we're using data, that kind of seam between the data and the creative creative experience is something that it's very intricate, and only a handful of people can do it. So I think that is also really important. Being able to interpret that data to feed that creative experience, and also not take away from it, because especially in our industry where we pride ourselves in our creativity and being able to give people great experiences. So we want to capitalize on that as much as possible.
Yeah. So it's not just about analyzing the data, it's about sifting through all the unnecessary data, I guess, to find those pieces that you need. So that strategy really comes in handy at that point.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely a lot of data out there, probably more than we can do anything with. So we're doing pretty good on time, and I wanna shift gears a tiny bit, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Drew, but you and I had a conversation about your days working retail and some of the uncomfortable training and conversations that you had around profiling people, around shoplifting and things like that. We spoke with Kofi about that a little bit, and Kofi, you brought up some interesting points around not just the frontline employees, but the broader organization. And I'll let you guys share those anecdotes. But then after that, I'd love to kind of talk about this question. Does technology or machines afford us an opportunity to do things that humans don't need to do anymore? And in and of itself, could that possibly help us overcome some of these legacy hurdles? So Drew, I'll let you get started, and then Kofi, you can respond.
Well, so I worked in retail in a sizable sports store similar to Foot Locker, but not Foot Locker, back in the 90s. So it was a different time in terms of customer service, whereas now there's less attention paid to the detail of customer service and more on running and getting items. So when I was working in retail, we were literally told to profile people. The way to do it was to make sure that you say hello to everybody that walks in the store. Not to be friendly, but to let them know that you are indeed watching them. We were told to look out for groups of 4 men at a time, always people of color, that they were running a scam, so it wasn't even discreet. It was pretty explicit in its approach. So you and I were having this conversation about, is that something that is better left to other sources than people and all of their baggage and whatnot to bring into that sort of a judgment call and whatnot. So
I mean, Drew, same here. As I think everyone has some kind of retail experience as a retail employee, and horrors are good and bad. But and I've certainly been on both sides, in the as a retail employee, being trained on from loss prevention on the floor, and then also kind of talking to companies as it relates to how they're really understanding who their customer is. Not too long ago, I think it was Walmart. I might be mistaken, but pretty much a big box store had got in trouble because what was happening is that within specific aisles, particularly the black hair care products aisles, and you can still see this in some other retail stores, I'm sure, black hair care products were always locked behind were under lock and key. So you had to kind of request it, and then it had to go. And someone had to go and get it for you. So a group of people brought up a lawsuits, and ultimately the big box store admitted that yes, it was a form of profiling, and it did not provide a level playing field, and it was biased and everything like that, and they removed that. But that's within the past 10 years. So the understanding of the brand on who the customer is and what the inherent bias is and unconscious bias, both within the managerial group, so those who are not on the front lines, but then also what's passed on to the front lines, is an area that I think needs to be rethought, both from how are you training and empowering the people right? So to understand, to realize and mitigate their unconscious bias on the front lines, but then also how are you also taking away some of the decision making from them and lend itself to technology, which does lend itself to, once trained properly, it lends itself to and it's more efficient in some areas. So as we're talking about redefining retail and the retail experiences, that's one area that I think a lot of innovation does need to happen. You know, how are we looking, how are we training people, what are we enabling people with, and what are we offsetting to machines who, again, have also been trained in a proper way and have been given the right information.
Right, that's such a great point. Like, the machines only know what we tell them, right, to train them. Drew, we're getting a Willy Wonka thing with you. Does everyone see Drew okay? Might be sideways. It's okay. We'll still take your points that you have to make. Oh, there we go. I think that's better. Awesome. Yeah, you know, I just think this is so interesting because, you know, when we go to trade shows for retail and we look at the ways retail is evolving, there's a lot of talk around RFID, NFC chips, you know, obviously computer vision with the advent of Amazon Go and other competitors who are bringing that up. And the notion that you could leave loss prevention to a machine so that you could focus your employees on being helpful, you know, doing the types of service that they can do. It seems to me that from an organizational standpoint could almost eliminate some of that type of training, and maybe they can refocus that on sensitivity training. That's my own personal thing. But as you guys are thinking about the store redesign and some of this sort of stuff, I think it's interesting also to note that there's a lot of stores that are going to be closing. And this is kind of a wild card question. We have a few minutes left. There's a lot of stores that have been closing. And so there's going to be a lot of available retail real estate. I think that there's been a lot of prognostications about what's going to happen to that. Is that going to become micro fulfillment centers? Is it going to become more entertainment based? Although, you know, what our entertainment options are moving forward can be a little tricky as well. What are some of your guys' thoughts around some of the future fact that we have so much real estate and a lot of it might be vacant?
Yeah, I mean, I recently saw a stat that said 25 to 30% reduction in square footage for retail, you know, by the end of the year. So, and I'm sure all of us, as we get a chance to venture out, we can kind of physically see that. My thought is that it will be a collision. A lot of the retail space will be reclaimed by communities, right? So, and what I mean by reclaimed by communities, that you know, retailers or real estate owners need something to do with that real estate, and they physically are in the community, right? So there's going to be this forced conversation between the community that the retail physical space exists in, and the owners of that, and the renters of that, so the brands as well, to say, okay, what are we going to do about this space? How does it affect the community? How can we use that space for pop-up stores or new trial initiatives, trial experiences? How can that allow us to have more of kind of a town meeting center or kind of a space to gather, to share ideas across different cultures, across different financial statuses? So I think that's one thing that we will see there. I'm eager to see what some of those think.
I think that makes really good sense, especially because obviously retail is positioned in community centers. It's already kind of facilities that are equipped to have people gather at them to accommodate parking and to do things like that. So that's very interesting, and that's actually one of the things I haven't heard as much. So that's a great point. I have a comment, Jillian, if you have a couple seconds here. On the brand new data, this is a question that comes from Jody. Hi, Jody. What would be your macro starting point if you're going to go out and start to gather brand new data today? Broad question, but I think you can handle it.
Sure. It's pretty broad, but I don't think we were off before. I think that the way that in the industry across brands that we've collected data was great. I mean, there's a lot of data sources available to us, but specifically in the context of retail, I think it would behoove us to really look at the micro markets across the country and not just look at a brand from a macro perspective and look at micro markets. So that's where I would start, because I think regionally, the types of shoppers and what shoppers want and experience differs so drastically from one town to another, not even one state to another. So I would probably break it down from a micro market perspective and then drill into different cultures and different, it could be anything like we talked about earlier, like technology adoption. If we want to look at the way an Android user interacts in the store versus how they interact on their device or online, that might be super interesting if we compare it to iOS users. If we want to look at in a large city culturally, the different types of shoppers and what they actually want an experience, then maybe that's another approach. But more tactical from a retail perspective. I'm looking at it from a micro market perspective, than doing more of a blanketed approach, even digitally. So, once someone visits our e-com site, we know where they're located or where they're coming from, and just tying that into the overall experience in the physical retail stores as well.
Great. Yeah. So hopefully that helps, Jody. I totally agree with that approach. We have the ability now that it doesn't have to be one size fits all for the entire United States, which as we're learning is such a diverse and amazing place. We need to start kind of embracing those communities and embracing the differences of different places and spaces. And then if you're a national brand or a national company, the tools and the data and the technology exists that didn't 10, 15 years ago that actually can foster that new approach, which I think is super interesting. Kofi, as you guys start thinking about those new types of experiences, and before we kind of run out of time, is there any other points that we missed today, or things that you're thinking about as you get started on this journey with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and a lot of what we're talking about today is scary for larger organizations that have been have a well-oiled machine, at least internally, to now kind of adapt to the external changes, particularly as we don't know where things are going to be next week, next month, or maybe even next year. I just heard that Broadway is not coming back till next year. My goodness. But I think one of the things that I was recommended to organizations is take a deep breath, because you're not in this alone, but also you have to be comfortable with listening. I think, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations have been really quick to act, and that's kind of how naturally the organization works. Quick to act, we have to put out a press release, or we have to do this, we have to change this, those kinds of things. But I think this is a time where it's all right to kind of take a breath, accept that things, you're not going to affect too much between now and the end of the year, maybe not even Q1, but it's set up your internal infrastructures from a listening perspective. Who's listening? Who's there interpreting what you're hearing? And then who's also making decisions as to what's next? And this is the opportunity for a lot of organizations to do that. And to your point, Steve, there are tons of tools that have been available for years and years and years. And so it should be fairly simple to set up a process that can now start affecting the internal behaviors and the decision making.
Yeah, that's great. I love the notion of just listening, right? Like that is kind of actually what sent Jillian, Drew, and I down this path in the first place. Is we just wanted to hear what was going on, and you're surprised what you can learn if you just take a few minutes to listen. So that's about wrapping our time for today. I wanted to thank the panelists. I think we could continue to talk about this stuff all day, and hopefully you guys can reach out to us on our social channels to continue the conversation. If you have additional specific questions, you can reach out to the three of us via the wongduty.com website as well. I want to thank Piers and the PSFK folks for having us. One thing we didn't cover today, and I'm interested to hear about, is what holiday is going to be like for retail this year. So maybe that'll be the next session that you'll see all of us chatting about.